Ladies and gentlemen, we now move to the final session. One of the things that the Centre for Geopolitics tries to do in general is to draw the lessons from history into current geopolitical challenges. I'm sure you'd all agree that the range of contributions you've had right throughout the day gives us an immense amount to think about in terms of the contemporary situation, and I'm really pleased with the way it's been going. We're going to run this session slightly differently to the previous ones. Each of our panelists, who I'll introduce in a second, will just speak for a short time, 5 minutes or so, on what they think the challenges for the Baltic region are in the light of the very intense security situation which is now faced following February 24th last year, and how to deal with that, with any reflections they have on drawing any lessons or thoughts from the historical panels we've had earlier today. We've got an outstanding panel, and the first contributor will be Michael Fallon. I've known Michael for very many years in Parliament, on opposite sides, I'm sorry to say, but he'll learn at some point. But his contribution here is that he was Secretary of State for Defence from 2014 to 2017, appointed by David Cameron, continuing under Theresa May as Prime Minister, played a key role in the Conservative governments of that time, looking at the challenges that had to be dealt with in that era. He has immense experience, both of the way the British government works, but through his being Secretary of State for Defence, with the way the whole of the NATO operation works and the various collaborations. I can say personally, for an early visit I paid to Estonia many years ago, his own intervention in support of Estonia at an early point when he was Secretary of State was greatly appreciated. People would say to me in Tallinn, quite apart from any other consideration, they appreciated, Michael, the role you did. So I'm very much looking forward to what you'd have to say today.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. And I think you and I, as politicians, are aware that the conference session just before dinner used to be called the graveyard slot. So I will certainly abide by your injunction. But I must thank you and the organisers for including me today. I have learnt an awful lot of history that I wish I was better aware of earlier. As Charles said, my first involvement with the Baltic states was the NATO summit in Wales, where we officially confirmed the joint expeditionary force. We announced the 2% spending target, and we worked up plans to deploy what was called enhanced forward presence, and that for us was the deployment of British troops to Estonia. All that was triggered by what Russia did in the Ukraine, and our understanding that our response to that needed to be a 360-degree view of NATO, that the northeast quadrant, if I can put it like that, was just as important as the southeast quadrant. And our analysis was right, it was welcomed. I will never forget standing with President Kirsty at that first parade in Tapa, when almost with a tear in her eye, I think there was a tear in her eye, she turned to me during the parade and said, "This is the first time we've had foreign troops parading in Estonia who were friendly," which really, really does make you think. So the analysis was correct, but I think my first point tonight was, I don't think in retrospect, looking back, it was sufficient. NATO spending has only risen very slowly. Modernization itself has been fairly slow, and we have not provided, over that period, since that NATO summit, obviously sufficient reassurance to Ukraine or to Georgia that in the end might have deterred Putin for what he did last February. So I think we need to be humble about that. And when we look now at how we might reinforce our security, I think we do need to bear in mind that nothing we did 9 years ago, in the end, stopped Putin launching a full-scale invasion on our own continent a year ago. So I make 2 or 3 points, and I'm fortunate to have General Doug here with me, who is going to fill in on the tactical detail. But they are fairly obvious points. First, the Joint Expeditionary Force. We should build on that. It's a highly flexible concept. It has members who aren't members of NATO, who aren't members of the European Union. It can be deployed very rapidly. It doesn't depend on consensus. People can opt in or opt out of it for particular operations. And I think there's much more we could do there in terms of deploying that joint expeditionary force in the Baltic and indeed more widely in the North Atlantic. Secondly, the forward presence. I think we do need to look again at the size and function of these NATO deployments in Poland and the Baltic states. Are they really sufficient as tripwires, I think we called them originally, to deter any large-scale incursion? And are we doing enough after the remilitarization of Kaliningrad to actually protect particularly the Kowalski Gap and the Polish-Lithuanian defenses? So I would welcome views on that. And thirdly and finally on air defense. We sent RAF Typhoons to help in Baltic air policing. I think there's a case for looking at the rota and getting more countries to contribute to air policing. But I think also, I would hope also, we would look at air defense itself, our missile systems. Is there more we can do in terms of NATO countries working together, multilateral deals, if you like, in purchasing and deploying particular missile defense systems? Those are three kind of military points that Doug Chalmers is far better equipped than I am to comment on. But I want to finish really on something else. That Russian invasion, is 10 years old. Russia invaded 10 years ago. We're into the 10th year of their invasion, not the second year. And I do think the Allies do now need to stiffen their resolve. There are faint hearts out there. There are siren voices out there now already putting compromise plans and settlements on the table. And we have the opportunity now in the forthcoming Vilnius summit here in the Baltic states for the Allies to stiffen their resolve. What do I mean by that? I mean looking at the supply of material to Ukraine, a drip feed at the moment. Surely that could be smoother and more efficient. I hope I won't upset other nationalities here by saying that if everybody had been as generous as the Polish and as rapid as the United States and the United Kingdom perhaps in making these supplies available, Ukraine might be in a better position than it is. So there is more to be done there. On sanctions, clearly, I think we need to enforce what is being agreed. Too much oil, I suspect, is still being produced and retankered and supplied on the international markets by Russia. That needs to be looked at. And I personally would favor extending sanctions to the families of those who've already been sanctioned. And indeed, I don't see why Russian middle classes, in the way they're allowed to travel, I don't see why they should be excused having to take on some responsibility, albeit for a government that they can't change, but some degree of responsibility for understanding what is being done in their name. And then I think finally, and I'm sure the Allies will rise to this, we need to understand that what is happening in Ukraine is a challenge to our democratic values as much as a challenge to the system of international law. It's an issue of principle as much as of territory. This is the invasion of a sovereign, democratic state on our continent, whose borders, by the way, we were party to guaranteeing. I think all of this makes this meeting today incredibly apposite. When the leaders do convene in Vilnius in a few weeks' time, the security of the Baltic states, Baltic security, simply becomes the security of us all, and vice versa. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. That's tremendous. Our second panellist is Doug Chalmers. Doug has recently, or relatively recently, come to Cambridge. He's the master of Emmanuel College and is already, I think, enjoying it a lot. But also he's the chair of the management committee of the Centre for Geopolitics, has just taken on that responsibility as well. But his history, as Michael referred to him as General Doug, he was Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff for Military Strategy and Operations from 2018 to 2021, so pretty recently. He has served in the Baltic. He does know many of the issues that we are discussing from inside the military camp, if I can put it like that. Doug, we're delighted you can join us this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for doing so, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
I'll try and build if I may, because during the period that was described, I was down in what the UK call our permanent joint headquarters, and I was the operations sort of director there at the time when the GEF and the enhanced force presence thing would come. So I had a feeling of what was described in policy terms and principles, then turning that into reality, so to speak. And I'll try to pull that together. And I think today's been really, really great, actually, particularly going back into history before. Some stuff I knew, but I hadn't really quite connected. And some of the tensions I'm going to describe, I think, do resonate from that time through to today. The first bit, purely on a military, factual side of it, the Baltic states aren't big. They're quite narrow in times, and the ground is quite different. And therefore, the old principle of space for time in the Baltics doesn't work very well. The Baltic Sea, it's been described already, there's a lot of territorial waters that encroach either way, all the way around it to come into it. It's not very deep. And there's a lot of infrastructure that lies underneath that not very deep sea. So you've got that combination there. It's quite a tangled bit of airspace because of all of those national sovereignty sort of areas that are around on that side of it. Therefore, one of the good things for me as a military technician, as I used to be, is having Finland and Sweden come into the NATO bit. We had common processes and procedures, but actually having that formal NATO coordination mechanism over the maritime and the air spaces will go quite some way to do it. The GEF came a long way to managing that in terms of within and trying to coordinate as a group of allied members which did not require consensus to act and coordinate together, which was one of the beauties of the document when it was sort of pulled together, to go a step towards that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then already touched on very briefly within that sort of geographic physics bit I've described is, of course, Kaliningrad. And the Suwalki Gap that sits in that beautiful, the history we heard today just resonates ever more today about that barrier that goes through. It has been incredibly militarized, the rocket systems, the air defense bubble, and the range rings that sit outside of Kaliningrad. Look, any sort of military physics person, look at it and blink. And I think there's another part in that is that the modern weapon system and range rings, obviously in this area, you don't have that space I talked about as before. So where do we go from there? Any form of deterrence obviously is capability, credibility, and communication. Everyone knows that. Bringing them into sort of NATO works really well. Where the tension for me, I think, really has come through is through the need to deter and to have the credibility of being able to defend. Now, those things you'd think are quite connected, but actually are quite difficult to connect because of the sovereignty of nations. And one of the things about the GEF, which was great as I got to know them in the earlier on, is we had a very open moment, fairly early on actually, where we described how we all do things, because there's a real risk that everyone mirrors everyone else. And actually how organised crime is dealt with in the different countries is different. How cyber is dealt with in those three countries is different. And even things like airspace control, civil vice military is different. And the laws in the land about what that can prevent, for example, a national industry being taken over by a third party, etc., are different. For me, that was a huge wake-up call and an eye-opener, because I have to admit, we came into the conversations, thought we knew, and actually we found those that have been living on the edge of Russia for far longer than us definitely knew a lot more. So there is this tension of the balances in that national sovereignty vice collective defence, which Article 5 obviously brings through, and the journey between the two. The GEF as a vehicle sort of helps sit in the middle of that to come on the way through. And part of that was that space and time led in 2014 the Wales summit to the enhanced force presence element. Different countries took up leadership. We took up the leadership for Estonia. US were in Poland, Canada and Germany, Lithuania and Latvia respectively. Each one of those in the early days was done slightly differently. And because it was kind of connected, it got lost in the middle of that deter and defend box to begin with, in that we took it on In Estonia, we arrived, we had our battle group there, and we realised, it took a year or two to be honest, that we needed to be inside the Estonian defence plan in order that our contribution would have some weight. The invasion, the subsequent invasion into Crimea has accelerated that element of wanting to be involved inside of those defence plans, not just be a tripwire, because that was the original idea. We'll die and everyone will take it seriously. It was kind of the idea of having those troops forward at that time. That generally was sometimes. I thought I'm not 100% sure I like this plan as we go forward. What has also happened in the time is NATO have recognised this, and they were trying to balance the sort of south and the north bit that Michael sort of roughly touched on there before Crimea, and then after Crimea it became more thing. But the north-south NATO tension was still very present, and a thing called DDA was born, deter defence in other ways through it, which is now sort of a growing concept, and beneath that now we have tighter regional plans which have taken over what were fig leaves, which we were political fig leaves rather than a military plan about how you join up that deter to defend path before. That journey has begun. It's not yet done because, like I say, the military side is the easy bit, but actually defence requires some of those other bits that countries do differently to go forward. So I think the balancing of national sovereignty and the tensions between the Baltics, let alone between the Baltic as a bloc and then the Russians, as we spoke about before, I think we're on the path to navigating through them, but there are still significant challenges as we go ahead.
Doug, thank you very, very much. That's tremendous. Our final panellist is Janis Kazocins. He's been the National Security Advisor to the President of Latvia and Secretary of the National Security Council since 2016. But he has a very interesting history as well. He was born in the UK of Latvian parents and then a British Army officer servicing the British Army on the Rhine, Northern Ireland, Norway, Belize and elsewhere. And he then, after independence, became the first UK defence attaché to Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. Janis, we're delighted that you're here with us this evening. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much indeed. And bearing in mind that the two previous panellists have already said the most important things about the Baltic region, I intend to look a little bit more broadly, and I will make 3 points. One is about global security, the second is about cyberspace, and the third is about what used to be called in the old British Army days hearts and minds. The world is about to, or this century will experience 3 existential threats of a kind it has never experienced before. Global warming is already leading to famine, will lead to mass migration and war. Biological threats isn't just COVID, there will be more pandemics. Biological weapons are being manufactured, antibiotics are being reduced in their effects, and there is a strong anti-vax movement. And as far as the nuclear threat is concerned, we have seen nothing like it. It's not just Russian saber rattling, but last week Russia actually cut off the power supply to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the largest one in Europe. In other words, if the 10 days of diesel supply to the generators were to run out, we would have Chernobyl plus. In addition, Iran, North Korea and others who are spitting distance, in the case of Iran, from nuclear weapons, are alarming their neighbors, and that will lead to nuclear proliferation. And we already see that in the AP region. The chances of a suicidal terrorist gaining access to a nuclear weapon is much greater because some of these countries, Pakistan, for instance, are not terribly stable. What does it all mean? Global threats can only be addressed through international cooperation, and that is why today has been extremely valuable, because we've looked at this region where international cooperation has not been very effective, even in recent times, and we see why it is necessary. And cooperation is possible only if the rules-based international order is followed, even if it's not in the immediate interests of powerful actors. Secondly, cyberspace. Data is the new oil. I assume everybody here is aware that China is scooping up all the information they can, particularly encrypted information, because soon quantum technology will allow them to decrypt it. And those things that we think are really sensitive and our secrets will no longer be sensitive. Big service providers are behaving like states. They have no financial incentive to do what is in the global interest or even in their national interest in some cases. Some talk about digital sovereignty, particularly those who want to do us ill. And regulation. Europe has been quite good at regulating the internet to a certain degree, but is Europe able to, and the West generally, able to regulate itself sufficiently to protect itself? Thirdly, information war. No longer a case of facts which you can overturn with other facts. No, we're talking about cognitive war, where attitudes matter much more than facts. Why does a third or more of the Republican Party in the United States still think that Trump should have won the election and that he's the best possible president? That's one example. Another one is the way that Ukrainian prisoners of war have been interrogated and asked about the crucified girl in Mariupol, which is completely made up. But those interrogating seem to believe it. We live in a very vulnerable society. Social cohesion is a real concern, and it's not just in the Baltic states, not just because we were heavily Russified during occupation, but because there is a radicalization and a lack of belief in the political class, added to which is corruption and our mirror imaging of what we think the Russians and the Chinese are up to. And I'll finish by mentioning 360 degrees. We talk about 360 degrees as east and south. I think that's wrong. 360 degrees means the western side of Canada and the United States, because the big problem that is coming up is China. And while Russia probably will be manageable, China is not going to be that easy. And it will depend not just on NATO, certainly not just on the United States, but on AP partners who need to trust the United States. They, as well as Xi, are looking at Ukraine. And if the West allows Ukraine to go down in some way in an unacceptable ceasefire, which will lead to more war once Russia has rebuilt her strength, then they will start wondering about whether they ought to find common ground with the Chinese Communist Party. That is not what we need. That is not the way that we will be able to deal with global threats. We need to be able to ensure that the rules-based order, which has been built up over the last century, continues to be effective. That means UN Charter, and if necessary, that it has to be enforced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Janis. Thank you to all of our panel. Now, we've got just over half an hour for Q&A, and I'm going to ask you just now to think if there are any points you'd like to raise. I'll kick off with one question to the three of you, but then I hope there'll be a number of people from the floor. My question to the three of you is that most of what we've been talking about just now is essentially strengthening our defensive resilience in a number of ways. The question that's in my mind is whether we ought to be thinking about any more offensive approach towards what's going on in Russia. I'm not so much thinking of military offensive measures, but the information war type of point that Janis made. Are there things that we could be doing that would weaken the Russian capacity to conduct the actions that are being taken? I just wonder if I could chuck that into it all, Michael, first, to see what you think.
Well, I'm sure there are things that we should and could be doing that we shouldn't equally talk about at all.
Spoken like a Secretary of State for Defence.
So I think we need to be fairly careful about that. But yes, obviously, to be less frivolous, there are things we can do, certainly, and we're starting to do them, I think, in terms of coordinating our response to cyber attacks and getting hold of the truth much faster than we did. And that, I think, is one of the keys to this, where there is misinformation, that it is tackled as quickly as possible and done in a way that can be translated across to, if possible, to a wider Russian population. So yes, my answer is I think there is more we can do where we have control, where we have techniques in terms of cyber, and I think there is more we can do in tackling misinformation.
Thank you. Doug?
I'll plead the fifth, as has already been mentioned. But I think that the bit that does strike me as being really quite interesting is that I didn't think the internal Russian narrative would stay as resilient as it has done so far, and it has done. And I think from his essay that he wrote, and then, as you rightly say, that belief that they have in it, I think has worked quite well for him, for Putin, in terms of his narrative. But what also is a bit striking me, really to be interesting, and there is a Chinese link in here as well, is if you look at the UN votes on it, it's quite telling actually that there's a lot of the world, Africa and the Middle East in particular, that have not come out on one way or another. And I think there is something more to be done there. I think we've done quite a lot. I think what we've seen really from the Novichok at sort of Salisbury forward is the very early declaring of intelligence to explain why we're behaving in a certain way, and in order to help attribution be more understandable outside. I think that's gone a long way, and I think you've seen that really take a step change over what's gone for. But it hasn't yet swayed the votes of some of these nations on there, and there's probably more to be done in that area.
Thank you. Janis?
Yeah, I'd entirely agree with that we need to do a great deal more. In fact, William Hague, I think, had a very good article in the Times this week in which he was saying just that we really need to be working with the global south. As far as Russia is concerned, I think that obviously coming from a country which can't change places with Switzerland, and no matter though we like skiing and mountains, we are always going to have Russia next to us. Therefore, our interest is having the type of Russia that we can live with. And the aim should be that the Baltic states and Poland should have the same relationship with Russia as Benelux and France have with Germany. And remember, in the last century, Germany invaded those countries twice, as Russia did with us. Therefore, it's not unimaginable. But what we have to do is start thinking about it now, because Putin is on the way out. People understand, those around him, that this cannot continue the way it's going. Therefore, alternatives have to be found, and they will find alternatives which allow them to maintain their strength, their power, the Siloviki, and therefore whoever or whatever replaces Putin will almost certainly be as bad or potentially worse. But that will not last terribly long, because it won't have had 20 years to build up the power vertical which has kept Putin in place so much. That's why we need to be thinking ahead. That's why Latvia, for instance, has twice as many Russian journalists working towards Russia than we have Latvian journalists working in Latvia. Why we support them, why we should be doing everything we can to help the intelligent diaspora, particularly that which has come out recently, to make plans for how to develop Russia once this horrific event comes to an end, after the post-Putin period, that we can try to help Russia develop into a normal state of the kind that I'm sure that it can be.
Thank you very much, Janis. Now, questions, comments from the floor. Can you indicate, please? We've got a number of people, I'm glad to say. Number one, number two. I'll take threes. Is there a third one who's come through? Three. I'll take 1, 2, 3, and then come to the panel. One.
Thank you very much. I was not present during the whole event. Ambassador of Lithuania, but really very much delighted to be here. If I would make one small comment and then the question. Comment is two speakers were very much concentrated on the Baltic region and the Janis Kazocins, whom I think we met many times, and Janis has zoom out with a bigger picture. I want to be a little bit in between and make a comments what I think is missing. One element is missing is Ukraine, because Baltic security is tightly knit with the future of Ukraine. Ukraine will win, hope, and this is we were supporting, but NATO membership of Ukraine, and without NATO membership of Ukraine, Putin or whatever who will replace Putin will come back, because Ukraine, sovereignty of Ukraine, future of Ukraine is ultimate goal of Russian elite. That's why we hope that if not in Vilnius, at least Vilnius will lay the ground for future Ukraine membership. But there are still many elements which are also missing in this mosaic. Energy security, again, Baltic security without energy security is unimaginable. We are very much in this direction, but still few elements are missing, like electrical reorientation to the Western grid and so on. Then Belarus, which definitely is very much dependent on, especially on the military security term to Russia, on some elements still portrayed to be independent. But if we will not fix situation in Belarus to better terms, again, it will be quite a nasty, at least eastern side of the border from Lithuania and from Latvia. So Belarus is opposed. So this is a few elements I would like your comments. And the question is on Jeff. We like Jeff. I came here September as ambassador. I was really thrilled how far Jeff is in all strategic documents of UK. But what is missing, from my perspective, and here I'm not as ambassador, as an expert, relation of Jeff with the NATO. Imagine Lithuania's military planners. We have enhanced forward presence German battalion, which is multilateral, even more complicated. We have American heavy battalion present. We have south of us Poland and American brigade, which is very much looking towards Suwalki Gap. And then Jeff comes. You know, if Jeff comes out of blue without precise meaning what is doing, it's really a problem. That's why how to make from the problem to the asset. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. As I said, I'm going to take 3 questions, but I should just say to everybody in the room that we owe a particular debt to the Ambassador of Lithuania, because when we go to our reception after this event ends, he has very kindly agreed to sponsor that reception. So we'll get a much higher quality of reception than we would have done otherwise. David.
Thank you. I'm David Cairns. I'm a friend of the program. I think I've read that the invasion of Ukraine by Putin was overwhelmingly supported by Russians. And I think I've read that in China, most Chinese people believe that this century is theirs and they support Xi Jinping. We are in an era where there is increasingly separate circles of communication that increasingly do not intersect. How do we improve mutual communication and understanding? And is it right that organizations such as the BBC and BBC World Service that are international brands and trusted, that they're cutting their foreign language programs? Thanks.
Thank you very much. And third, John, could you?
So, well, first of all, thank you very much to the speakers for your remarks. My name is Peter Watkins. I used to do something in the Ministry of Defence, and I would like to ask a question that starts with enhanced forward presence, but we'll then move on a bit. As was said, enhanced forward presence was envisaged as a tripwire, sometimes called a speed bump. And the idea of it wasn't just to kill General Doug before his time. The idea was that if the Russians invaded, it would trigger a response from NATO in terms of mass new deployments to the region, etc., etc. I just wondered if the panel might say anything about how credible that concept is. I mean, NATO is moving from the old NATO response force to the new NATO force model. That's part of it. But the other angle of it is infrastructure. The infrastructure that used to exist in Western Europe to move large numbers of troops very quickly, Germany had a key role in this with German railways and so on, has largely atrophied. And there is an EU program to address this, military mobility. And so I just wondered, on the back of that, whether you might say something a bit more, because you haven't mentioned it, about the role of NATO-EU cooperation in addressing the wider issue of security in the Baltic. And also, and I'm going to be a bit political here, in the wake of the integrated review refresh last week, what should the UK be doing now? There was an EU-sized hole in the old integrated review. The language has changed. The government's won the vote today. How do you think the UK might contribute to this?
Thank you. Well, I must say we've got an exceptional range of questions to go back to the panel. I'll come back again to the hall, but let me just go to the panel first. Which of those would you like to deal with?
Well, I might just very briefly comment on all of them. Where does the GEF fit in? I mean, the GEF fits in because the GEF works. The GEF goes to sea rather than talking about going to sea. It fits in, obviously, between nation-state level and NATO. And I don't think it complicates either, because it's simply opt-in or opt-out, and nobody is compelled to do anything. But GEF doesn't have to wait. Doesn't have to wait to find consensus. And General Doug will add to this, but I think the militaries themselves have found it useful. And GEF can do anything. GEF can work on humanitarian issues. I suggested at one point that we have we replicate the GEF in trying to get grain out of Ukraine to Africa, that we involve some of the countries like Egypt and and Turkey and perhaps Italy in helping to get those ships out through the minefield. There are a lot of examples, I think, where a fast, deployable, voluntary organization is desirable, and I don't think that cuts across any kind of rapid response or even the new EU deployability. David Cairns, I completely support. We shouldn't be cutting, what few international methods we have of actually tackling these separate information circles, and the BBC is definitely one of them. On Peter Watkins' point on the tripwire, I think in another context, has Brendan gone? No. He's here. Brendan and I have been at a seminar where we had some academics, I think, analysing just how effective tripwires have been in previous decades at actually deterring. And there isn't a huge, I think it's fair to say, the conclusion was there isn't a huge amount of evidence that tripwires actually work. I don't know if that seminar has been written up, but that seems to be what I recall about it. And certainly, there's more to be done in terms of improving the mobility, internal mobility of NATO, which I'm sure General Doug would like to touch on. So far as NATO-EU cooperation, I seem to recall at the Warsaw Summit, there was an agreement on 5, 6, 7 areas of cooperation, 7 or more. Then that is certainly something that ought to be done at Vilnius. So far as Europe is concerned, I'm pleased that the British government is now participating in the European political community. We don't know quite where the EPC is going to end up, but I think it's very important that non-EU members are involved in it, and I'm particularly pleased that London will host it next year. I personally would build now on the agreement on the Windsor framework and see, what other areas slowly we can build on, improving the relationship with the EU, starting with academic cooperation over Horizon and other things like that, and perhaps start picking off a number of issues where we can start to restore something of a more mature relationship.
Just for those of you who haven't been able to follow the news today, what Michael's referring to is the Parliament supported the government on the Windsor Agreement and those various issues overwhelmingly. I think 515 votes to 29 or something like that. So you had the 60 DUP people voting against and just over 20 Conservative MPs, which is a small number from this point of view, and will allow the Prime Minister and the government to feel some confidence in moving ahead, whether in the directions Michael's suggesting or in others, I don't know. But that's an important development in UK-EU policy that's happened in Parliament this afternoon. Doug.
I'll do my best to sort of skip through. So, Ambassador, first, on energy security, agree that did not covered, but actually absolutely critical, actually, to much of what we've talked about. And that's my slight alluded moment to sort of discussing underwater as much as surface sort of connections. On Ukraine and NATO, the timing is when that conversation comes back on the table, rather than if, I sense, but now is probably not the time. On Belarus, concur. On Jeff, I think, and this way I'll skip between it. This is when my experience was of, okay, because we went through the Jeff when it was born to do hurricane relief and some other bits that came up to it. And then it moved much more back into regional priority to focus through, where national defence plans were starting to be shared and that sort of mirroring stop was starting to be done. We very much connected into US Army Europe in some of the big US Army Europe exercises to go through. Because one of the real strengths of, if you go to the JEF headquarters, which sits on our SJF HQ headquarters, of which the JEF staff, the military second staff, sit within, the heart of that is actually an interagency element that can bring some of those fine wiring bits together. That connected as a group that choose what they want to go into depending on the context of what is the escalation going on. Of course, it's not going to come in a nice clean line. It'll come in some sort of jagged way. Is recognized by the Americans before. Because in the early stages of an escalation, it will be the Americans, and Jeff provides a framework for other nations, I think, to make some of those first steps before NATO has formally crossed and issued orders to go through. And it's one of the beauties of having the US Commander Europe also being secure to be able to sort of help us understand that. It gives him a nightmare every day because he's got to split his brain in half, but it does help us, I think, as a collective to run through. David, yes, I agree completely without anything. The world service and the reach of it that used to be such a branded thing on multi-medium sus is there, but yes is the answer. To Peter, you and I have had this chat before. I think Ben Hodges sort of started and really raised it up into the overarching bit and made people realise railway gauges and the stuff that moved, why the Suwałki Gap goes that way as much as that way, and the importance of it, I think, was there. We did make some gains on it. It's probably gone a bit flat. There's more money to be spent on it in terms of making it work through. And in terms of the tripwire, I think it has started to be taken more seriously because, like I say, they were depending on which country. Each country took it slightly. Some were into war plans, and some were decorative pieces that sat on soil elsewhere. The reality of them now having to be able to fight has led to talk about stockpiles. How does reinforcement take place? What happens when the port that the reinforcement was going to come through was going to? These are thoughts that are happening now, but like I say, that's the next bit on that detail of the plan that needs to go through. On the NATO and EU, I think, the IR was very much a framework, and there was lots on partnerships, but not much detail on how to strengthen those partnerships and how to give real meaning to it. In fact, we damaged, I think, some of those partnerships, I would argue, in between. I think things like today's vote will help, I think, on that journey to do. But there's a lot of work to build individual partnerships and rebuild trust those individual partnerships to go forward. On this particular bit, on the military piece, I hope that we focus on deter and defend, and I hope that the worst aspects of the military-industrial complex don't get in the way of that as we go through.
Thank you very much, Doug. Janis.
Yep. Ambassador, Ukraine, that is the squaring of the circle in Vilnius, because while a war is going on, Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO, because then NATO is automatically a party to the war. But Ukraine quite realistically wants to have some sort of security guarantees, maybe such as the Budapest Memorandum, which was mentioned earlier, or the Bucharest Statement that they will definitely be a member of NATO sometime in the future, which led to the invasion of Georgia. In other words, this is not an easy one. And that is why the top minds in NATO are looking for some sort of answer. As far as Belarus is concerned, I think that's now so closely tied in with Russia that whatever happens in Russia in the future will have its effect on Belarus, maybe even the other way round, particularly if Putin tries to force the Belarusians to go to war, if he has no other alternative. How to improve communications, all I would say is that in Riga we have a handful of BBC, Russian service, we have Deutsche Welle, and RFE-RL, I assume everyone knows, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, over 100. Well, you get what you pay for. Deterrence. Deterrence by punishment was put to sleep in Madrid. It is now deterrence by denial. Prime Minister Kaja Kallas of Estonia put it very, very nicely, though not entirely truthfully, that the NATO plan is that the Baltic states will be taken over, and then NATO will get its act together, and 6 months later will free us. But having seen what happens in places like Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, Mariupol, there won't be any Baltic nations left to free. As an example of what we're doing to deny, the inner German border during the Cold War was 1,400 kilometers roughly. The land border between Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, Belarus and Kaliningrad is 1,635, 230 kilometers longer. On the IGB, we had two army groups, each of 4 corps. Each corps had at least 2 divisions. Each division had at least 2 or 3 brigades, and so on. At the moment, we are arguing about 1 brigade in place in each of the Baltic states. If it wasn't so sad, it would be laughable. On the other side, there are new ways of going about warfare, which I think Doug knows far more about than I do, but we see them happening now in Ukraine with aerial platforms, autonomous platforms, and once they are controlled by AI, then they will be able to make decisions based on the intelligence which comes from up top, hundreds of times faster than the very best divisional or brigade headquarters ever could. These are the sort of directions we should be going in. And as far as air is concerned, bear in mind that the Finns and Swedes have 2 of the best air forces in Europe.
Thank you, Janis. Doug, you just wanted to add a point.
Just quickly, because I didn't fully hear it. So what we've seen in some of the exercises is the host nation armies and defence forces and the mobilisation of reservists and all that stuff talked about. It is, and there is these. We're seeing this in the Ukraine of how you use better sort of sourcing materials. You use sort of low Earth orbit, in order to get the connective tissue together, and then you use a sort of an AI-based but visualization tool to speed up the decision-making and the fires that are going on at the moment. But you still need munitions. And there's a stockpiling of munitions, etc., that sort of go on. And I mentioned that time and space thing. There isn't going to be much time to prevent this sort of step you've just described there. My real concern is we went into this war across NATO, stockpiles low. And actually, on the other thing that I worked for the Secretary of State past with over in counter-ISIS, we'd spent a lot of our stockpile there as well, and we never really fully rebuilt it up. And what we are seeing now, as we gift more and more to the Ukraine, is that that's dwindling our stockpile even more. And so that credibility I've described about our ability to defend the Baltics doesn't mean lots of infantrymen sitting in a country. It's making sure that the stockpiles to service the platforms that are actually going to be required to do the fighting are in the right place at the right time. They don't have to be co-located with the aircraft, interesting enough, but they have to exist and they have to be in the right place.
Thank you, Doug. Now, I'm now going to go to the floor again. Can I see people indicating? Go 1, 2, 3. Can I see other people around the... I'll go 4, actually. I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, first you.
Thank you. Hi. My name is Henny. I'm a Norwegian MPhil student here at university. And I just wanted to ask about bringing together what you said about economic sanctions with approaching Russia and dealing with Russia after a war. Because when talking about economic sanctions, especially towards the Russian middle class, this is based on the idea that the Russian people have some agency in the leadership and government of Russia. But at the same time, this has been quite controversial, the idea actually that going after civilian population will lead to an overthrow, and especially when the state actually controls all of the information. And then at the same time, we have been closing off communication channels with Russia in many ways. And so what I am wondering is then after the war, how do you think that we can balance out kind of punishing now and trying to damage the economy and the Russian people and isolating them culturally as well, while at the same time making sure that we can influence the way that Russia will be built after the war, especially now that China has much more influence, and so that happening in a way that supports Western interests.
Thank you. Then Suzanne, please.
Thank you. Suzanne Rain, Centre for Geopolitics. I wanted to ask a slightly complicated question about the right to self-defence. The war on terror was justified in law according to the UN Charter on a right to self-defence, which includes a right to preemptive action if you feel yourself under threat. And it's noteworthy in the case of Ukraine that the country which has invoked that UN right is Russia, which justifies the invasion of Ukraine on the basis that they had to do something before they were attacked. And Ukraine has not, so the support for Ukraine is not being provided as self-defense for Ukraine in the same way. And so the question, it was prompted by this debate about tripwires and forward defense. So the best form of forward defense is attack. And we used that in the war on terror. We said we have to attack the enemy before they attack us. Is there any set of circumstances, I appreciate the answer is probably going to be no, where the only way that the Baltics could defend themselves is by taking action before an attack happened?
Thank you. There was somebody in the middle. That's it. Yeah.
Really to pick up on what Janis was saying, we've got 3 crises, of which the Ukrainian is the least. China's next, up. Taiwan, thank you. And then at the top we've got global warming. I think one, not answer, but you have to try and include those in a combined concept of defense, security. And I think at that point it also becomes easier to sell to Western electorates generous provision to the third world to cope with climate change. This is a security issue for us. Secondly, I would say you're going to find it very difficult to persuade the majority of Russians that Crimea isn't Russian. And I was on a program with a Chinese intelligence colonel professor last week,
He said, what you've got to do is keep on persuading us that there is a peaceful option for reunification of Taiwan and China. Does anyone really believe that? I mean, you know, we're heading straight into a 1914 situation as far as I can see. And the third point is, this country seems to have spent its time undermining the most effective weapons it had in the Cold War, one of which was indeed, I'm party prey on this, my dad was the boss, but the Russian service and then, you know, the world service. The second was the British Army. It seemed to me that one of the most obvious things we should do right now is reverse the decrease in the size of the army, you know.
I wonder what Doug's going to say about that. Okay, I've got one more question before going to the panel for the final time. It's Adam over there.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Adam Burr, I'm Foreign Office, but I'm also a visitor at the centre here. My question is quite a simple one, really. We've been looking at, if you like, the adversary, but do you think as a panel that we've done enough work to understand our own vulnerabilities? And in framing that question, I'm just reflecting that a year ago, the political discourse in this country was centred on how we would be strangling, ruining the Russian economy, and that would be a tool by which we would secure our objectives. And you might say a year on, with the economy in the state it is, and having just escaped, hopefully, quite a serious banking crisis, that perhaps that wasn't part of the calculus this time last year. And how confident are we that we've thought through our own vulnerabilities at this point?
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panel now to respond. I know you can't respond to all the points that have been raised, so just pick and choose which work for you. And then I'll make some closing remarks, and then Brendan will wind up.
Okay, let me try a few of these. First on the sanctions, the Norwegian point. You're right. I mean, this is a controversial area. I wouldn't support sanctions because I thought they might lead sanctions on, you know, families of those who have been sanctioned, or indeed sanctions on travel of the middle class, because I think it would lead to an overthrow of the government. I don't think they have that kind of agency. I fully accept that. I just don't think it's morally right that middle-class Russians should be able to evade any sense of responsibility for what is being done in their name. So, you know, I don't think we should overclaim on it. They don't have agency, but I don't think that still excludes, you know, us looking for other ways of trying to make sure that they do share, even if they can't fulfill it, they do share some responsibility for what is going on in their name. And I hope there might be some common ground between us on that. On Susan Rain's question, which I don't think I fully understood. I mean, of course it's true, and there's been a lot of work done on immediacy and on preemption and all of that. But we also went into Iraq at the request of the Iraqi government.
But in self-defense. So we went into
Well, it was self-defense, but it was at their request. The Russians can't say they've gone into Ukraine at the request of the Ukrainian government in any sense.
They went in defense of Russia. So
Well, they may have done, but that, you know, that's not quite the same as our involvement in Iraq.
Suzanne, let Michael answer that.
I don't think it is quite the same. So I would ask you to think about that. And I think also we need to think about, you know, what immediacy actually means. When there was a very direct threat to us in the West from terrorist outrages here on the, you know, in Western Europe that we did have to deal with, as well as bringing succor to the elected government of Iraq. But perhaps we could continue that outside, because I haven't made a very good attempt at answering your question. On dealing with and Doug made a really important point about the rest of the world. What's disappointing is that those 40 countries who didn't support the first resolution haven't supported the second one either. They're still there as a bloc, not just in Africa, they're there in the Middle East. And I'm embarrassed to say I have to take this badge off when I go to the Middle East, which I do on business, because the whole conflict is viewed quite differently in the Gulf, and it is certainly viewed differently, down further south in Africa. And I do think we need to find better ways. Climate change was mentioned, but also food security and so on, of getting this argument across. On size of the defence estate, Doug is far better qualified than me to tell you what the proper size of the army should be. I didn't reduce it. I think I'm right in saying we held it where it was under my defence review. I've repeated, a number of you have heard me say this before, if you go back to the turn of this century, before 9/11, before international terrorism, before Crimea, before North Korea had missiles, Iran was developing nuclear weapons. If you go back before of all that, at the turn of this century, we were spending 2.7% of our GDP on defence. That was in the year 1999. Today we're boasting about spending, 2.2 or 2.3, and we're worrying about setting a target of 2.5, and we're not even pinning that target to 2030. So I think you can tell where my sympathies lie, but Doug will tell you exactly what the size of the British Army should be.
Thank you, Michael. Doug, what should the size of the... No, it's all right.
I'll skim through those very quickly. So on the sanctions bit, I would, and having sort of been involved in sort of Iran and Iraq and places that have seen sanctions over some time. Sanctions are easy to put on, they're quite hard to take off. But I think in places where there are an elite, like we are talking about here, they are an incentive in some way. But the gearing of how to take sanctions off, I think, is a key bit of work, actually. And we haven't ever really cracked it. Because once they're put in a sort of an international mechanism, it's quite hard to sort of bring them off in the same way. And China does have a part to play in that. On the right to self-defense, I'm not going to avoid that trap. Before. But I would say that's one of the reasons why the people in the South are not siding with us. They say, you're a bit hypocritical. You said it's good for you, but it's not good for them. How does that run through? Now, I don't think they mean that. That's a useful way of them just not agreeing with everything they say. There's a Chinese reality of debt trap probably connected into some of that in some way or another. I think on the preemptive side of it, which you talked about before, this is the classic thing, is that at exactly what point does people like I used to be believe the intelligence is absolutely definite? And then at what point do you take it to the politicians who make a political judgment on that bit? That's a tough thing. This is very different than a hostage rescue or something which is more definitive like that. Therefore, I think back in the rule of law, that would be very difficult for us to sort of, international laws for us to do. That doesn't mean that we can't have everything planned, mapped and gridded to go, but there's the first mover type thing I think we can go through. And we're getting better at that, and that's some of these things that we've seen going on at the moment. On the global security issue, I think you're absolutely spot on. There's a macro bit here. In 5-10 years from now, the increase in flooding in some countries, etc., is going to be existential to some bits. That will lead to new layers of stress and human tension we haven't quite cracked. This does feel to many like a Western problem at the moment. That doesn't necessarily include them. They have bigger challenges just in looking after their citizens on a day-to-day basis. I don't know the answer to that. It's a very big thing. On the Crimea, I agree, I've wrestled my head around this ever since 2014, actually. You come to quite a quick thing on the Donbass. There's international instruments that we've seen being used in before. I think the Crimea is more difficult to come through. On the army, that's a tough one. Obviously bigger is better. But that's too obvious, and therefore I'd like to expand a little bit more on that. There's the equipment style and stockpiles, which I've already talked about before. There is the simple reality that new technology has brought new weapons of war. It has not taken any away, and therefore you've constantly got to add more to, rather than have a sort of one in, one out type policy, which is a problem. The reason I think people like the Army, not just the Army, I think the Navy in particular, I put in there as well, and the Air Force as well, is we are a nation that's got a good brand for the human equities inside defence, and we're small. And that's actually really, I found that with some of the other, a lot of countries, they found working with the Americans was overwhelming, that they could not cope with the scale that was done. They liked talking to a smaller country, coming up with training programs for people, etc., and human equity to do that. And I think that is where I think our human capital in defence, I think, can do more. We're now very small, and our capacity to do some of that is quite tricky to do because we just run out of capacity to do all of those bits. So the answer is yes, please, more. But more people as much as more stockpiles, and that's going to be a tricky bit. On our own vulnerabilities, do I think some of that work's going on? Probably. Can it all, though, be addressed? Go back to the other problem before. I think actually what we've also got there is we used to get problems in sequence. We've sort of got them all clustering together at the moment. And that means what we don't necessarily understand is what's a scene that we're vulnerable on or what is just a concurrence. That adds difficulty to a really fudgy answer to your question.
Spoken like a general. Thank you. Janis.
Russian economic sanctions. We must think about the future of Russia, and maybe it isn't that very far away that we will be thinking about a Marshall Plan or something equivalent, not just for Ukraine, but also for Russia, because they still think that they didn't lose, that is, Putin and his clique, they didn't lose the Cold War in the same way as the National Socialists didn't believe that they lost the First World War, that they were betrayed. And they were betrayed so that the West could steal their resources. And that is a generally upheld belief. And that's why next time we have to be much more canny about it. And we need to help them because Russia has not had any serious investment in infrastructure for over 40 years, apart from carbon fiber, apart from oil, gas, and coal. And that means that us all trying to go green is going to hit them incredibly hard. But Russian politics is not made in the derevnya, in the countryside. It's made in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and that is the target that we should be going for. Suzanne, a right of self-defense, that is precisely why the international rule-based order has to be upheld and indeed enforced. And it's most interesting to look at China, because for the moment, China is a status quo power, one China policy. If it's a one China policy, then there ought to surely be a way in which Taiwan can be a full part of that one China. And that's why Russia's attack on Ukraine makes them feel queasy. And it'll be very interesting to see how that develops. Vulnerabilities, I would only draw attention to one, and that is the US election in November 24. And what is that likely to mean for democracy worldwide?
Okay, well, I think you'll agree we've had an absolutely fantastic panel discussion. I just want to add, for information about our programme, that we, on a couple of the questions that have been raised, we had a very good seminar a month ago in the House of Lords on energy security in the Baltic and energy resilience, which is one of the points, Ambassador, that you made. And we have a strong report that was prepared at that time. That is not recorded because it was a Chatham House Rules event, but we have a report which will go onto our website fairly soon on those points. Secondly, just on the point about the Ukraine, just to say to those of you who might not know that we had an excellent seminar in Riga 10 days ago on the relationship between the three Baltic states and the Ukraine. And it was a very good discussion indeed. And I certainly personally learned an immense amount there. But just to say that either will be Donatus or is on our website, is it already? Is, so that you can see a recording of the day-long seminar that we had in Riga, as I say, about 10 days ago on our website, so you can find it. And just to say, we've been talking a lot about how to get proper discussion on Kaliningrad. We had a very good session, online session, at the end of last year, but we've been thinking how can we push it further forward. It's a more and more pressing question, and we've been trying to think how to take it further forward. So with that, can I thank the panel for being with us today. Thank you very, very much indeed. And I'm going to ask you all just to stay on the platform just for 5 minutes. Brendan is now going to come up and say a couple of closing remarks, and then I'll do the housekeeping points about moving ourselves to the ambassador's hospitality. Brendan.
Thank you very much. Well, sadly, this is the last session. Alarmingly, it's entitled Closing Remarks, which suggests that I might attempt to sum up this fascinating day. But reassuringly, I've only been allocated 5 minutes to do so, which means I really have time to do 3 things. First of all, to note the constant resonance between past and present that we saw throughout the day. This is very much a centre for geopolitics, a hallmark of our approach and events. We saw it with our keynote at the beginning with Holger Afflerbach, who stressed that the story he was telling, as it were, hadn't yet played out. We saw it in Westerberg's account of Swedes in Estonia, reminding us, of course, that a number of Swedes had died recently and killed in Ukraine, so the question of elected affinities. You see over time, we heard about neutrality, a moral position for Scandinavian states in the period we're looking at today, but now, of course, something that's increasingly being abandoned. We heard about German policy incoherence from Holger Afflerbach, listening to Kęstutis Kalinskas and the unhappiness of the Lithuanians with German arms supplies in 1919, reminded me a little bit of some of the discussions around the German forward presence in the country today. Then we have the centrality of the British role, mentioned by several speakers, Andrew Lambert, of course, on the Royal Navy, on the Åland Island disputes, and of course, we heard in today's panel also the central role being played by the UK in the deterrence effort. We heard about really the question that's exercising us all, which is Russia's view of its state, the indivisibility of the state, which was something that was talked about in the first half of the day with respect to the Baltic states, and of course that echoes today in its relationship to that region, but also Ukraine. This is not, of course, an exhaustive list. I haven't mentioned other speakers. I couldn't, but I think what I've just spoken about indicates the richness of the day that we've just had. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I'd like to express some thanks. I'd like to echo what Charles said about Janis who curated this event. It's really, you can see the coherence and the thread of what is put together. I'd like to thank, on the organizational side, John Freeman, Karis Whitcomb, Danny, Figueroa. I'd like to thank Charles, of course, our guiding spirit of all our efforts. Charles has, in fact, already thanked His Excellency, the Lithuanian ambassador, but I do so again. And of course, I'm grateful to you, the audience and the panelists, for making this a fantastic event. And you will make it an even more remarkable event if you return your landmarks. I think Danny or somebody else has set up a checkpoint. As you leave, you will be compelled to hand them over. But I hope you'll all agree that this second Baltic Symposium has been a great success. And I hope that you'll also stay tuned to the Baltic Geopolitics program in general, but also to the symposium. We'll be back next year for the third symposium. And that brings me to the third, final thing that I wanted to say, which is to welcome you all very heartily to the reception, which is over in the Graduate Hotel. Hugo Bromley will be exercising his traditional role, leading you there and holding open the gate which separates us from the old Garden House today, the Graduate Hotel. But that's it for now. Thank you very much.